All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the official Basement Bodybuilding chest exercise tier list. This is one I've been looking forward to for quite a while at this point because chest training is way oversimplified in the fitness industry, and there's a lot of useful yet fairly simple concepts to understand that will greatly improve your understanding of chest training and especially your chest exercise selection, which is huge for making progress. So, with that being said, one little note that I wanted to give before this video starts is I have reacted to Jeff Nippard's chest tier list as well. So I've given my thoughts on a handful of these lifts already. One little thing that I do want to say first is it is context dependent where the rating actually falls or where the lift falls for each rating. Did I say no? Where the rating it what basically what I rate each lift is context dependent. So if I have like 10 more lifts that I think are S tier on my list, something that was maybe a little bit higher on his list might fall down because a tier list is based on the lifts that are in the tier list. And I want to make sure that's known. If I give something a B tier that I said was like an A tier lift in his tier list, it is context dependent. It doesn't make the lift actually better or worse. My opinions haven't changed since I made that video. I just want to include more things and include my more thoughts on a few of these lifts here. I did want to touch on my own criteria just to give you guys a little bit of a look into my mind when I am grading these lifts. There's a handful of criteria, so a few different boxes that have to be checked in order for me to rank one of these lifts highly. I have four specific criteria that I'm looking at with each one of these lifts, among other factors that are going to vary from lift to lift. But these are kind of like the four cornerstones of what I look for when I'm selecting exercises for chest training. Before I get into the actual criteria itself, I did want to say that Barbell Apparel is having a summer sale. Same as last week. You guys have heard me talk about this one before, but if you're unfamiliar with it, basically the way it works is it's a buy two, get one free that applies to all shirts and shorts. So if there's two t-shirts that you like and one pair of shorts that you like, the third item will be free when you order two of them. So if you want to check the link in my description, you can look at my collection. It supports the channel and you're getting obviously top tier clothing that goes in the S tier in return. All right, let's get into the criteria. So the criteria that I have here, there's four main things. And this is also what I talked about on the Jeff Nippard tier list reaction, his chest one. So number one is going to be stability. And what I mean by stability is if the weight that you're lifting is locked in and it's stable, that's going to add points for stability. So if you're using a machine or something along the lines of that, that's a more stable lift. So it adds to basically muscle fiber recruitment because there's no other areas where tension can leak, assuming your setup and technique is proper. More importantly for stability, maybe not more importantly, but another huge aspect of stability is going to be having some type of either opposing force or external stability to your body that allows you to lift, whether it's a machine or just a free weight, consistently without the weight becoming too much for your setup to handle. So if you look at something like, say, a standing cable fly, if you're doing a split stance cable fly and say you're doing 50 pounds and you're an 150-pound person, that's pretty easy to move because that's only a third of your weight. It's not going to be doing a whole ton. But if you're 175 pounds and you're flying with 100 pounds, that's obviously going to require a lot more internal bracing and kind of like pushing into the ground to try and maintain your own little split stance. Where if you just had like a pad behind your back, that would add to the stability. So the lift isn't going to change as obviously as you go heavier on it, because as you build muscle, you get stronger, you have to use more weight. And as long as the lift can remain consistent over time and it doesn't challenge your bracing a whole ton to the point where the lift does just become objectively worse, where it forces you to cheat or forces tension to leak through other ways, then of course it's hard to rank a lift highly when that's the case. So next one that I want to talk about here is the converging aspect. So if you're pressing on, say, a Smith machine or barbell, it doesn't really converge because it's one fixed bar. So you come down and then you press up. You're going in the same vertical path with both hands. But if you were to use, say, a machine that converges it, so it starts nice and wide, and as you press, they come together, that gets more range of motion in total for your chest. So this isn't mandatory. It's just a criteria that can help rank a lift a little bit higher, especially if it's a unique aspect like converging and actually having tension during that converging process. Number three is going to be, does it give you a nice stretch? And is there actually high tension in the stretch? The good news for chest is more often than not, unless there's an external method that changes the leverages of the lift, pretty much any lift that lets you get nice and low is going to give you a nice big stretch. So Most often this is the case, but not always. So that's another thing to keep an eye on. And number four is going to be the resistance profile. Again, for chest, most lifts are going to be length and biased, assuming that there's no change in the actual resistance profile itself. If it's a flat resistance profile, then it is going to be length and biased in the vast majority of cases because the way your chest works, if the weight's stacked over your elbow and you're at the bottom when the chest is stretched out, this is going to be peak tension because the weight is farthest away from the axis, which is your shoulder in this case, at peak resistance. During the contraction, and as you start to contract, especially if it does converge, it becomes a bit more exaggerated. Then your chest has better leverage, and horizontally speaking, they're going to be much closer. So there's less of a moment arm, and that just makes the lift length and bias because of physics. With that being said, let me present my screen and we can get into it. Here's a nice surprise too. Look at that. No ads except for that little duck in the top right. So we've got 6 total tiers to go through. Sickening, which is going to be the top tier. Beauties, which is one step beneath that. Good complementary lifts. I can expand on that later, maybe when I put the first lift in that tier. Next one beneath it. This one is if you really like it, it's okay, lol, but there are better options tier. Then there's the gimmicky, fake, natty, influencer, cringe tier, and there's the morally wrong tier. So you might be saying these bottom 2 tiers, like, how is this gimmicky, fake, natty, influencer, cringe tier really better than this morally wrong tier? I just wanted to include both of those names. I couldn't decide which one I wanted to include, so I decided why not both? Just know that the ones that are here are actually a step ahead of the morally wrong tier. So with that said, let's dive into some of these lifts. I've got a bunch, a lot that you will probably recognize, maybe a couple that you don't recognize, and it's all in a totally random order. So I'm not ranking them in any type of order in terms of like what goes first and what goes last. So pin press is the first lift. The pin press is a classic lift for strength development on the concentric. So a pin press is essentially a barbell bench, but you're starting from a dead stop. So it's almost like a deadlift and bench press combined. So what you're doing here, resting the bar on the pins and then pressing up. So there's 2 kind of quote unquote problems with this lift that might prevent it from getting a super high ranking. One, the pins, in order for the bar to be touching the pins, they have to be above your chest. Whether that's half an inch or whether that's 2 or 3 inches is going to depend on how you set up or what options you have access to for pin height. But either way, you're not getting quite a full range of motion in that lengthened position. And 2, you're not using any stretch reflex on the pin press because the weight is going to be dead at the start of the lift, and the stretch reflex will dissipate, assuming you do a true dead stop or wait long enough between reps. So the pin press, not terrible. This is one of those lists where there's a lot of very similar options that are just better, like a Smith bench or a barbell bench. But it's not terrible because it is still training a big range of motion. It's very standardized and it's still length and biased, even though it doesn't get the most muscle length that you could possibly get. So I'm going to say this pin press will go in the if you really like it, it's okay, lol, but there are better options tier. Next lift that we have is going to be the bench press. The bench press is a very solid lift for a few different reasons. So one, it's quite stable. You have an opposing force beneath you, which is going to be the bench, and then you have a barbell. So while it doesn't converge, it does add some stability compared to something like cables, rings, or dumbbells. The bench press is a solid lift. The downsides to the bench press, I've talked about this a lot before. They're more community/social oriented. I think a lot of people tend to chase strength on the bench, and that usually comes at the expense of your technique if you really are getting eager with the strength. There's also a crazy amount of peer pressure and just pressure from influencers in the community and whatnot, just to slap on as much weight as you can and just chase strength on the bench press. Reasons like, oh, it will carry over to your accessory lift, so you just have to get strong, just get a 1 rep max, and then your working sets that are like higher reps, you'll be able to use more weight if you get a stronger 1 rep max. It all kind of revolves around the 1 rep max, and of course, if you follow the footsteps there, you can kind of go down this rabbit hole and discover your initial instinct. It all comes back to kind of ego lifting. So if you can train the bench press properly and just treat it like any other lift, really, it is a quite solid lift with a few downsides. It doesn't converge, it doesn't get a major stretch, and it's not entirely stable. So I would say the bench press, it would be kind of a low beauties tier, maybe a very high complementary lifts tier. That feels a little bit low, so I'm going to go in the beauties tier because overall, it's probably the most stable you can get outside of like machines and stuff like that. So barbells, not the most stable thing ever, but it's not something you necessarily have to worry about on the bench press. Up next, we have the selectorized machine bench press. So this has a handful of different models. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say it's an even resistance profile. So it's as hard at the bottom as it is at the top. The weight travels in equal speed and equal distance, the entire concentric and eccentric, with no slowing or speeding up. And there's no warped cam either that will mess with the resistance profile. So we're going to say this is a flat selectorized machine. We're also going to say this one does converge because some do converge and some don't. Some of them are just one piece, and you can press up or down and they don't go in and out. They're not separate handles that are still stable, of course. We're going to say this one does converge. So a machine bench press, this machine is great because one, it has a seat, so it's pretty easy to adjust your seat height, and you don't have to worry about like a flat, say, plate loaded press, for example, and you have to kind of adjust your body to the handles. So that makes it very easy to standardize and set up. You can just say like, all right, leave it in my notes. I sat at seat height number 7. You can make sure you're doing the same thing every single time. It's incredibly stable. It can go as deep as you need it to go because usually they are going to be adjustable, and there are ways around it too if needed. So if you want to put like a mat or something behind your back, you can go even deeper. I think I already said it converges. It's very stable, and you can basically add weight forever because it's going to be the same motion over time. It's not an isolation lift that changes over time. All you might have to do is just get a gym pin at some point. So machine bench press, this is going to go in the sickening tier. It really is an excellent lift. It's very overlooked. I used to make fun of them because it's a gimmicky, silly little machine. And if you trained on that, you're not hardcore. You're not training hard. All those little excuses. The secret is just treat that like any other lift that you would train hard, and you're good to go. It's all about intensity, not about what lift you're doing as far as intensity goes. Up next, this is the reverse grip bench press. See, this is where me being blind gets me into trouble because I'm going to have hard times seeing these little details. So the reverse grip bench press. This is a very unique lift because it puts obviously your hands backwards. There's a couple downsides with this. One, you're usually going to be a little bit weaker for 2 reasons. And when I say weaker, I'm not saying like maybe getting more out of less weight. I'm kind of saying like maybe getting less out of less weight. One is just going to be your grip is a little bit less stable with this. Two, your elbows are tucked much more. So it basically stretches your chest a little bit less, and that means a little bit less force output. Most importantly, when it comes to the grip itself, what you're doing here, I'm going to try and show this as like a little example. So, when you're normally benching with the barbell, you're with a pronated grip, and your elbow is also beneath your shoulder if you're looking from a bird's eye view. So, what this does is it pulls your bicep down. So, your bicep lengthens and it puts your forearm next to your bicep. So, you have all this stability, all this strength, and all this cushion in this bottom range of motion. So when you flip your grip around, you're now supinating, and your bicep starts to shorten, and your forearm goes on the outside now, the meaty part of the forearm here. So you're less stable, you're less, I guess, bloated in this area down here, and the joint's a little bit more exposed. So I'm not saying it's going to injure you or hurt you or anything, but you're just going to be a little bit weaker and a little bit less stable, which can limit how much weight you can use. And it's not the weight that really matters that much. It's more so just the force output. If that's holding you back from putting forth a maximum force output from your pecs themselves, that can be a bit of an issue. And of course, with proper training and learning how to stabilize with that grip, you can improve the lift a lot. But it's not one of my go-to lifts. What I would use this lift as is like a temporary rotation. If you're feeling like some shoulder problems or something like that, or just want to refresh something for a few weeks for the sake of just trying something different, that's exactly what this lift would fall under, in my opinion. So this would be if you really like it, it's okay, LOL, but there are better options tier. And I think this is a perfect example of that lift. They're great lifts, but there are little things that probably hold them back from being a regular staple. Up next, we have the close grip bench press. So the close grip bench, it's known as like one of the main tricep builders. And the triceps can kind of be the limiting factor here at the lockout. But I would also say when it comes to training the triceps on the close grip bench, it's not going to do a whole ton for the long head. It will work pretty well for the lateral head, but the triceps are still a secondary mover, and they're going to have the best leverage at the lockout. So I wouldn't rely on this as a tricep builder. They just highlighted the triceps for some reason and not the pecs. Since the triceps are going to be fairly limiting in this lift, the chest isn't going to be able to produce max force output either. So it's very stable. It doesn't really converge. Your chest technically goes through a big range of motion since when you lock out instead of a regular grip with your pec here, it's a bit closer. So shoulder width maybe a little narrower, maybe a little wider, and that's cool. So it adds a little bit of range of motion, but it's not super high tension because usually what's going to happen is your elbows are going to start to flare out. And now there's a pretty big moment arm between your elbow and your grip, which does place a good amount of tension on the triceps. And that takes, of course, away tension from the pecs because the triceps are going to limit that. So the close grip bench, I'm going to put this in this tier yet again. If you really like it, it's okay, LOL, but there are better options tier. Next one is going to be the barbell floor press. And I'm not putting, this is going to be another one of those. Oh, wait a second. No, it is not the barbell floor press. Nope, that confused me. This is a pullover. Very obviously. I was reading the words, not looking at the picture. So the pullover. This is a lift that uh when I started lifting was quite popular for the chest. I actually did it every now and then for the chest too, because everyone was like, oh, I kind of feel my chest working, and it does work your chest. And then over the years, people started to hate it more and more and more for pec training in particular. And the people that say it's not very good for chest training, I'm in agreement with them. While your chest technically is going to be working in this motion right here, one, you're going to be limited by your lats and the long head of the triceps and the teres for sure. Uh, what's also happening here is your chest works in a way that it kind of leverages your rib cage. So when you get a big arch, you can get a big stretch with like a dumbbell or a ring or something like that. And that's just exactly how your chest is supposed to be working. You can kind of just feel that instinctively. But with a pullover, your chest isn't going to be wrapping around your rib cage. You're going up and over towards your collarbone like this. So you're not getting a big range of motion for the chest, and you're not stretching it, and you're not using it how the chest is basically going to have its best leverages. And there are other muscles that are going to be limiting factors. So uh, pullovers, great lift for the pecs. This is borderline morally wrong tier. I'm not a huge fan of them at all. Up next, this is the Prime plate loaded machine. So the cool thing about these Prime machines, I talked about this a little bit last time in one of my other videos. There's three different pegs you can load the weights on. So if you load the plates on the top, it presses back in an arcing fashion. So if they're at the top, you start kind of at the bottom of the arc and you press up. You're kind of starting at 9 o'clock and pressing up towards 12 o'clock. So it gets easier. It's a descending resistance profile. As you press, it gets easier. As you get lower, it gets harder. This machine also converges, and it also allows for a full stretch. So you can manipulate the resistance profile. You can train it in a lengthened, shortened, or just general mid-range bias, or you can even combine the two by putting some plates on some pegs and some on the others. You can mess with the ratios entirely to just really feel what feels best. It has unlimited potential, and it has everything you would ever need for chest training. So it's going to be the converging aspect. It's stable, lets you get a deep stretch, and you can make it a lengthened bias resistance profile. The lift doesn't change as you go heavier on it. So it's great progressive overload potential. The only like downside to this is, as a content creator, it feels weird to say that. As someone that just, as a bodybuilder bro that makes YouTube videos, but part of what I should be saying, or what I feel like I should be saying, is, oh, well, most people don't have access to it. So therefore, it's not worth talking about. Just don't say it's a good lift. No, it's an awesome lift. And I'm not going to lie about that just because most people don't have access to it. It's a sick lift. And if you have access to it, you should know that this is the best it gets and you should absolutely be using it. A lot of people say the barbell bench is the best because most people have access to it. If you have access to a barbell bench and the Prime plate loaded chest press machine, please use the Prime machine. It's just a better lift. It really is. So this is going to go in the sickening tier. This is even a step above this. There we go. Because it converges. And oh wait, no, we said this one would converge. This one absolutely does converge. It also has a lengthened bias resistance profile if you want or not. So it really is a good lift. Up next, we have the hammer strength plate loaded press. So the cool thing about this machine, it does converge. It's very stable. You can get a very deep stretch. The problem is it's not it doesn't give you the options to adjust the resistance profile since there's only one peg. And that one peg is going to be below the axis. So with this machine, it ends up being mid-range, but a little bit short biased. It's a little bit of a mix between a mid and short range lift, mostly a mid-range lift. So if I had to pick one resistance profile, it's probably 80% mid-range, 20% short biased. So it really is a good lift. The resistance profile isn't really enough for me to knock this lift at all, unless it was like super short biased and the axis was just like way up here. Then yeah, that's just not a good lift. But everything else, it kind of checks the box. It converges. It's stable. It lets you get a nice deep stretch with good enough tension in the stretch, anyways. Uh, it's just a solid lift all around, and this goes for any lying plate loaded machine, assuming it's a similar axis setup here. So I'm going to put this in the sickening tier. It's a little bit below these two, in my opinion. It might be about on par with this machine press actually, but the prime, this is like the S plus tier if I had to pick one of those. Up next, we've got cable flies. So these cable flies are just regular, not high to low, not low to high, just staying parallel to the ground the entire time. This is going to be dependent on the cable system you're using. If you're using a functional trainer, then when your arms are all the way out by your sides, assuming you're just an average height person, uh, basically when you're in the full stretch, there's going to be a lot of tension on a functional trainer because now your forearm and your arms in general are going to be perpendicular to the cables all the way at the back. If you're using like a cable crossover, so like one of those double tower giant cable machines with the bar connecting and the pull-up bar in the middle, now those are so far apart that unless you're super tall, uh, it's going to be quite short biased. So that changes one, how much weight you can use. Two, of course, it changes the resistance profile. So the cable fly, it's hard to say which one, because obviously it's just one picture. I can't just pick one lift here. There are two different variations of cable flies that are quite different. There's the lengthened and the short and biased, as I talked about. So with the cable fly, the benefits are it's very easy to set up. It does converge. It can get you a nice stretch. However, when there's no back support, so when there's no opposing force holding you forward, the progressive overload potential is terrible because you're not going to be able to support yourself if you're flying like 100 pounds in each hand and you're a 200-pound person. That's going to pull you right back. And if it doesn't, you're putting more effort in just staying upright than you are actually lifting the weight with your pecs. So for those reasons, assuming there's no back support, I'm going to put the cable fly in the gimmicky, fake natty influencer cringe tier. And the name of this tier is, of course, an exaggeration. I do want to refresh you on that. It's a fine lift. It really is a fine lift, and you can make it a fine lift too if it has back support. Then the tier jumps up quite a bit. But assuming there's no back support, that's how the vast majority of people do them. It is not the greatest lift. It's okay when you're a beginner, but it's just like it's kind of a secondary lift that doesn't have good potential at all because as you get big, you get strong, and then what happens then? The lift starts to suck. Up next, we've got this incline hammer strength plate loaded machine. The plate loaded machines by hammer strength are all going to be short biased. You can see this very easily on here. You can see it rotates on the axis right up here, and then the plates are loaded beneath it. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just different. So since this is a short biased lift, it's going to be very hard at the top. You can actually see my hammer strength machine back there, and you can kind of see that same exact concept where the plates are going to be much lower, about 45 degrees downward from the actual axis itself. So when I'm at the lockout, it's really hard. When I'm in the stretch, there's really not much tension at all. It's still a decent lift. You might be asking me, like, why do I have a hammer strength machine if it's short bias and there's no stretch? Well, you still have to train the pecs in a short position on occasion. I'm not saying you even have to have one like a short bias lift in your program at all times, but phasing them in here and there, one, it's much easier on the joints and recovery, and two, most most chest work that doesn't converge, you don't really train the short position at all. So since that machine converges and it's higher tension in that contraction, you're going to be basically bringing your arms across your body and towards each other. So at shoulder, basically shoulder width grip, right, probably 25% of the lift of the range of motion from lockout to the full lockout. There's a ton of tension on the pecs, which is really cool, and it's very unique. So while it's not an excellent lift by any means, it absolutely has a time and a place just because converging and high tension in that basically contracted position, in that short position, is extremely rare. So there's really nothing else like it. You might say, oh, well, dumbbells converge, but there's no actual resistance on the convergence. And chest lifts, when there's no external factor manipulating the resistance profile, they're all going to be length and biased in the first place. Basically, the way that works is, let's say you're doing a dumbbell bench. The axis that your chest is going to be working with is your shoulder. At the bottom, when the dumbbell's stacked over your elbow all the way out here, you're basically an upper arm's distance away from your shoulder in a horizontal view. As you press up, the dumbbell, so stacked over your elbow, gets closer until it's directly on top of your shoulder. So while you're actually converging, one, there's no side to side resistance, making that converging actually challenging. And two, it's much farther out down here, so it's much harder. And then by the time you get here, you get much better leverage and it gets very easy. So the incline machine, it's very unique. I would say this is a good complementary lift. It's kind of roughly in the same tier as these lifts. Like it's hard for me to say like, oh, the pin press is definitely worse than this lift, but they're kind of unique in their own ways. And there's going to be some overlap in some aspects of these lifts across the tier list, because the way I see it is, aside from kind of the extremes, a lot of lifts just have some things that they do really well and some things they miss entirely. Especially with chest training, having variety is going to be key, especially as you get more advanced, because it's hard to find a lift that trains all functions outside of this machine right here, this prime machine. What a beauty. Up next, this lift is going to be the seated hammer strength press. So basically it's the same exact machine as the previous one. The only difference here is, instead of pressing up in an incline, you're just pressing out. So with this machine, again, it's kind of unique. It's not necessarily one that I would rely on as a primary chest builder, but it kind of has the same talking points as the last lift. So I'm not going to waste your time trying to explain this. It's just a flat variation of it. I'm going to put this in the good complementary lifts section. Up next, we've got the incline dumbbell press. This lift is overall pretty solid. Again, it kind of depends on how much arch you're using, how much of an angle you have the bench at. If it's like super low and you're not using much of an arch, versus if you're maybe using a huge arch and you're going super steep, it is going to change the lift. It's going to change what parts of the chest are recruited most and how much the upper chest in particular is going to be working. So the incline dumbbell bench, it's a staple lift for so many people. It's tried and true. It does get you a pretty nice stretch. The way most people do dumbbell pressing, the way most people do incline dumbbell pressing, they really don't get much of a stretch, but it's not the end of the world. And it does add a lot of tension to the triceps, because what happens here is most people just kind of come directly down. Their elbows will flare out, but they'll stay close enough to where the big chunky part of the dumbbell on the inside does hit their shoulder or their chest, and it limits the range of motion. And you're also, more importantly, you're reaching in, which takes tension off the pecs by placing a moment arm between the weight itself, so your wrist and your elbow, since you're not stacked anymore. So that's an issue. But technique faults aside, if you do the lift properly, it's a great lift. It trains the upper chest very nicely. It has a usually roughly a mid to lengthen biased resistance profile. One thing to note with incline pressing is, since your rib cage is going to be much lower down in comparison to the actual bar path, you are going to be getting your elbows much below your shoulders, compared to like a flat press when your elbows kind of end just below shoulder height for most people. So the actual resistance profile is going to be a bit more mid-range biased. So even though you might get more of a stretch, the tension will start to drop off the more into a stretch you go. I'm not saying it's a bad thing and you should avoid that. It's just the reality of trying to get a stretch on a press that is mid-range biased. It's not incredible. It's not a huge stretch, and that's why you probably feel it more on incline flies. But the incline dumbbell press is solid overall. Only awkward thing is dumbbells just get big and chunky as you go heavier, and it's not very stable, and that's why so many people mess up the technique. So it's a solid lift. This one's going to be a little bit tricky to rank. It's definitely not in top tier. I would say it's probably a little bit above the good complementary lifts. I would put this kind of in the lower end of the beauties tier. There we go. That's probably an appropriate ranking. Yeah, right along with bench press. That makes sense for the most part. Dumbbell flies. Another example of one of those lifts that was like loved and hated, and loved, then hated, and then loved again. Now we're in the love phase. It's a solid lift. It really is. Yeah, you can't go as heavy on them because you're not pressing and you're just doing a fly, but it's not the absolute weight that you're using. There's a bigger moment arm, so there is going to be more basically more tension relative to the weight that you're using on the pecs. You wouldn't be able to obviously use as much as you could press because you're involving other muscles and shortening the moment arm. But the dumbbell fly, it's length and bias resistance profile. There's a bench under you, so it's not like that standing cable fly that gets funky as you go heavier. The lift doesn't really change as you go heavier, unless for some reason you have another limiting factor like your biceps or elbow flexors in general that maybe can't really hang, especially in those deep stretches. So it's maybe not quite in the top tier just because it's not the most stable, and it's you can have other little limiting factors in there like the elbow flexors potentially. Hard to standardize, but overall, if you just go hard on this lift and kind of forget about tracking, it really is solid. So I'd put this in the beauties tier. I would. I'm not going to worry about ranking them within each row within reason. Like if something is definitely better than everything else, I'll do it. But it's debatable if this is better than those two or worse. So up next, we've got dips. Dips are a very solid lift. Uh, Again, most people kind of do them incorrectly. A lot of people end up getting their shoulders kind of bothered from them, but I prefer to kind of look more at the people that do the lift properly, the people that can get most out of this lift and what you should strive for with this lift. Just because someone does something wrong doesn't mean it's a good lift. I talk about that all the time with machines. People don't train hard on machines and therefore they say it's a bad lift. It's not a bad lift. You are the problem. So with dips, it's not the lift that's the problem. It's usually the user. It's a user error situation. So dips overall, they're solid. It's a bit of a closer grip, so it can be a little bit more challenging on the triceps and hard to stack your joints, but your elbows do generally track behind you. I find that's where most people feel strongest and most comfortable. It's not the most stable. It can get a little bit funky trying to stabilize your shoulders and your scaps. It's very easy to kind of shrug and change the angle of your back to like kind of cheat the range of motion. So it's comparable to like really nothing in that way, but I'd say in the sense of like kind of cheating to change the range of motion, it's comparable to a dumbbell press. So I wouldn't quite put dips in the top tier, but I would say dips are going to be kind of in this beauties tier just because the stretch is so insane. They're not the most stable, but obviously you're pressing downwards and your body ends up going up. So there's no need for an opposing force outside of the actual handles themselves. So very stable. It doesn't converge. It gets an insane stretch, and the resistance profile is mid-range bias to lengthen bias. It all depends on the lifter. It all depends on your range of motion, but generally the resistance profile isn't going to be an issue here. So I'm going to put these in the beauties tier. Up next, we've got the camber bar bench. A couple different variations of camber bars. Obviously, you have the one that kind of has the quick kinks, and then it's just a flat bar at the top of that. There's also the one that is just a very mild arch throughout. I think it's the buffalo bar. I might be misremembering that. I'm very rusty on my powerlifting stuff. So camber bar bench, it's very solid. It's hard to say that it's better than bench press. Like, yes, it gets you a deeper stretch, but it's not any more stable. The resistance profile has not really changed. It does get you more of a stretch, but it still doesn't converge. So I have a hard time putting the camber bar bench all the way in the sickening tier just because it does lack the stability, which I think is kind of a big factor. And remember, the margins here are pretty small. So you might be saying that's, oh, come on, it does so many things well, you're really not going to put it in the top tier. It's like, well, to be in top tier, that's when, like, the margins are small. Like, just having a lift that converges, that's a big enough of a change to warrant going up a tier or two. So camber bar bench, I'm going to put in this beauties tier right here. So up next, we've got the Incline Smith machine bench. This is a staple in my own training and it has been for a very long time. The cool thing about the Incline press is it has the benefits that something like a Larson press would have because you can't really use leg drive and get a ton out of it. But it doesn't lack kind of that instability that a Larson press would have because your butt is on a seat. So your butt is that next point of contact, sitting in a seat, not just resting on a bench with your feet kind of kicking out. That you really do need your feet for stability on a flat bench, in my opinion, unless you're trained specifically for the Larson press. But with an incline Smith bench, especially, your feet are kind of just planted. No matter how much leg drive you use, it doesn't really help you that much. And it's very hard to lift your butt up too. So it's a very strict lift, but it's also length and biased and it's stable. So with that combo, a strict lift does make a lot of sense. I've talked about that before on the channel. It's a really nice lift to target the upper chest. I can't really think of anything that gets that much better than it aside from a prime incline press. That's the same concept as this flat press up here. So the incline Smith bench, I'm going to have to put this one in, not that one. I'm going to put this in, I'm going to put it in sickening tier. So this is where there might be a little bit of a separation between these three and this prime machine. The prime machine really is the best in my opinion. Everything else is still just an incredible lift that you can get absolutely jacked with. This one just has a little bit more going for it. That's absolutely kind of a luxury at that point. So absolutely sickening tier. That does make sense. Up next, Smith bench. They have two Smith benches. I just clicked like one of the default chest exercise tier lists and added all the other ones that I wanted to. But they have two Smith benches on here, so I'm going to put this at the end so I don't do it twice. Smith bench, it's a classic lift. I think it's a staple for bodybuilding. I've had it in my program for a year and a half at this point. Yeah, a year and a half, a little bit over a year and a half, actually. Got it in January of 23, and I've been doing it consistently ever since. It's one of those lifts where everyone tells you have to use a barbell, but then sometimes you kind of get tempted to switch it up. You try the Smith and you're like, that feels oddly good. If I wasn't going to injure myself on the Smith machine, I would definitely use it. But you didn't know that you won't injure yourself on the Smith machine. It doesn't matter if people say it's less hardcore and you're not going to train as hard on the Smith machine. It's like objectively looking at it, the Smith machine is a better lift than a barbell bench press. There's really no, I don't think there's any debate otherwise aside from maybe the bar path. But even then, one, it's not a big enough deal. And two, you can just get an angled Smith if it really is that big of a deal to you. The Smith bench it's a top tier lift. There's nothing else I can really say about it. It's excellent. It really is excellent. You can grind the crap out of those reps too. It's just, there's something so nice about the Smith machine. That stability really just, it's so nice. And I think it's missing in a lot of kind of like classic chest workouts with just barbells and dumbbells and whatnot. So up next, this is a decline dumbbell bench. So this is a funky one. This is not a popular lift, and it's not popular for good reason, I think. It's still a solid lift, but since you're on a decline, the dumbbells, as they get bigger, they're going to make contact with your rib cage. And the problem with this is since you're elevating your rib cage so much, or more so just lowering your shoulder joint just by being on a decline, the dumbbells are going to contact your rib cage much sooner than it would on an incline or flat press that you could kind of get away with at least a little bit more. So with that said, the decline dumbbell bench, while it has solid mechanics, just practically speaking, it doesn't make a whole ton of sense. And to go a little deeper into the practically speaking, how are you going to get big dumbbells into a decline bench without a spotter or a very unique kind of fancy system? I know I'm a little bit of a hypocrite because I said, oh, the prime machine's great, but not everyone has access to it. This is a situation where it's such an awkward lift to set up, and there's nothing unique about this lift that you can't do in like a machine or just with a barbell. So for that reason, I'm going to put decline dumbbell bench. I'm going to put it in the gimmicky, fake natty, influencer cringe tier. It's still a very good lift, and if you have a practical way to set it up that you can do that isn't an absolute pain, it's kind of a fine lift. If you have a set of dumbbells or a technique you use that allows you to still keep your joints stacked and get a full range of motion, and you can set it up properly, it's a great lift and it really is solid, and I would rank it higher, but I think for those reasons, I am going to keep it a little bit lower for now. Up next, dumbbell floor press. So dumbbell floor press, I mean, this is kind of the technique people use when they're using just a regular dumbbell bench because the dumbbells are going to make contact with your chest anyways, but aside from just people doing it kind of incorrectly or not how I would do them, the dumbbell floor press is an okay-ish lift, but you're just kind of cutting the range of motion for no reason. I have a hard time saying this is any better than a cable fly or even a dumbbell decline bench. So I'm going to put the dumbbell floor press in this gimmicky fake natty influencer cringe tier. Barbell floor press. It's like a dumbbell floor press, but with a barbell. So it is more stable, but it also doesn't really converge. I would say the barbell floor press is a little bit better than a dumbbell floor press. So I could kind of see the barbell floor press going into, I could kind of see that going into one tier above it. It's also much easier to set up a barbell floor press since you can just rack the bar. And when you're using dumbbells, it's like, I'm trying to think, do you have to do like a Turkish get up to set that up? It's kind of ridiculous. So barbell floor press, I can't really say this is any worse than like a pin press. Again, it kind of varies person to person. Like some people have a big rib cage and shorter arms, and you can kind of touch your chest just like a regular bench press. And then some people have super long arms, and you end up 5 inches off your chest. Barbell floor press. This is if you really like it, it's okay, lol. But there are better options tier for sure. Up next, archer push-ups. I didn't include this one. Archer push-ups they're morally wrong. Yeah, they are. I hate them. Regular push-ups. This is the most underrated lift in the mainstream fitness industry, and they're the most overrated lift in the underground lifting industry. So among like noble natties and this whole community, push-ups are overrated, I think. They're an okay-ish lift, and there are ways to modify them to make them better. You can elevate your hands, you can get a little bit deeper, you can use a backpack to add weight. You still have to keep in mind the stability aspect, more so in bracing in this context, with obviously your core, your hips, your knees. There are just way more points of contact, not points of contact, way less points of contact than on just using a bench or a machine or something. Push-ups, I mean, I wouldn't, it's tough to say. So there are ways to make push-ups better, but assuming this is just a push-up like being shown here, I can't say I would rather do a push-up than anything in the, if you really like it, it's okay, lol, but there are better options tier. So I'd put this in the gimmicky fake natty influencer cringe tier. And that's quite ironic because I really do think it's our community that overrates push-ups. I think push-ups and ring work, I think, is overrated in this industry. Not this industry, this community within the industry. And yeah, by the way, rings I didn't put on here because they are much less common overall. I don't have enough experience with them personally to feel like I could give an accurate rating. But rings, I would say if they were in obviously my section down here, they would absolutely fall somewhere on this list. So up next, we've got incline push-ups. Not even going to talk about that. Incline push-ups, I mean, that's honestly, it's worse than a regular push-up. Morally wrong. This is, the hex press. Let's go. So the hex press, I got this idea from Jeff Nippert. I kind of forgot about these, but it's where you put the two dumbbells together and you just, you press up like super narrow neutral grip. One, it makes your joints feel kind of weird because you have less meat around your elbow. Two, it's super awkward to stabilize, even if you do have the actual hex dumbbells that can kind of fit nice and snug. 3, your range of motion is going to be limited. 4, you never actually get peak tension because you never stack your joints. The closest you get to stacking your joints is at lockout. There's no stretch, not even close. It doesn't converge. The resistance profile, what would even the resistance profile be here? I guess it would technically be lengthened biased because your triceps have just such terrible leverage at the bottom since the angle actually changes. So it's more length and biased for the triceps, but even then the stretch and the overall stability kind of sucks. I have no reason to still be talking about this lift. It's morally wrong. There's no one can argue that. Machine chest fly. Okay. Well, one, that's morally wrong that this person called it a machine chest fly. It's a pec deck. I took that personally. A pec deck, not a machine chest fly, is an excellent lift for the chest. It's extremely stable, all sorts of adjustments on it, and even the cool old school ones, they have a giant handles that come all the way down. You can grip it wherever you feel is best rather than just having these tiny little handles for like kids' hands, basically. And you have to adjust the seat. So the old school ones, you can adjust the seat and you can adjust just by placing your hands at a different part, just like you would with a barbell. So extremely stable since it's a machine. The lift doesn't change as you get stronger and add weight. It does converge, obviously. It's an insane stretch. You can adjust how far of a stretch you want to. Beautiful. And the resistance profile is usually flat, sometimes length and bias, just because of the cams they use. It really does depend on the machine. With all that being said, it's a little bit better than a dumbbell fly. The resistance profile isn't going to be as good in a lot of cases, and but that's not really an issue because it's not a short bias; it's a flat resistance profile. So worst case, if you fail right here, you can just keep doing length and partials, and that's a great time to implement length and partials. So machine chest fly, I'm going to put these in sickening tier. This list or this top tier is actually getting pretty big. I'm happy with that. Decline push-ups, gimmick, morally wrong. Wait, yeah, it doesn't matter. I don't like these lifts. Anywhere with the gimmicky fake natty or the morally wrong, it's in there. Incline barbell bench. So incline barbell bench, little bit more of a stretch than a flat barbell bench. Like I said earlier, the incline obviously kind of lowers your rib cage and heightens your shoulders, which is the joint you're going to be pressing with for your pecs. So incline bench with a high bar path feels really good. So you don't have to press up and back quite as much. It makes it a little bit easier to learn. It's more stable overall. It is more strict. Incline barbell bench is a really solid lift. It's really hard to cheat. This is high beauties tier. I would put the incline barbell bench. This is one that I would note that I am ranking above the rest of these. I am ranking it above the rest of those. So next lift that we've got, this is the Larson press, and the person doing this Larson press, he looks kind of familiar. That's Freaky D, crazy strong. I think he Larson pressed 550 or bench pressed 550 or something wild. I think he flat benched 550. Larson presses like crazy. The Larson press overall, it's a really good tool for power lifters or people that are very strength oriented with their bench work. And the reason for that is because once you become so refined in that movement, you know how to like optimize things like your leg drive, your bracing, your arch, even like how much you flex your glutes so you could raise your hips even more off the pad without them actually leaving the pad. There's just all these little things. I've been in that powerlifting rabbit hole before, so I'm aware of them. That just make your stimulus to fatigue, especially when you're strong like Freaky D. There's all these little things that basically kind of take away from what you're doing with just your chest. So the Larson press takes away the arch, it takes away the glute flexing, it takes away the leg drive. The downside with this is now you're losing some stability, which is going to be an issue. Specifically at first, you can overcome that over time just by training and getting used to it. It will always be less stable, but it usually won't be too big of an issue. The Larson press is it's a great accessory lift for powerlifters. It's great for people that are very strong and looking to get a little bit more at a less weight without sacrificing the actual tension that's going directly to your pecs. The lack of stability, especially at first, if you're using it for like a shorter term phase, which is what I'd recommend for most people, that can become a little bit of an issue because I think by the time you'd be ready to rotate the lift out is probably the time you'd be mastering the lift, even with the lack of stability. So I can't rank it too high, but I would put the Larson press in. I don't know if it's quite as high as these. I wouldn't say it's as good as a bench press with your feet planted. So I'm going to put this in the high end of the good complementary lifts category. I think that makes a lot of sense. And just keep in mind, all of these top 3 rows, these are all very solid lifts. I wouldn't rely on them as like your primary, like main mover, but they're all lifts that you could absolutely include in your program. These are all 3 of these lifts I have in my clients' programs at various times. Not every client, obviously, but if you just look at my clients as a whole, I guarantee you all 3 of these lifts have been in their programs either recently or now or at all times moving forward. Not everybody, not all the time, but they'll be in there. Decline bench press. This is a solid lift. Range of motion is a little bit funky because it's kind of natural to bring it to your lower chest, and that really does limit the range of motion. So it's really good for training the lower pecs in just overall a shortened range. It's still a length and bias resistance profile, but you never get too big of a stretch. So you're training them in the shortened range with a length and bias resistance profile. So it's a little bit funky in that regard. It's pretty stable. It's definitely very strict. It does not converge. You don't get a stretch at all. The resistance profile is pretty good. The decline bench press, I would put this in the If you really like it, it's okay, lol, but there are better options tier. It lines up kind of with the rest of these, I'd say. Up next, dumbbell bench press. So dumbbell bench press, solid staple lift. I built a lot of my chest as a beginner using the dumbbell bench. I progressed quite well on it. I grew my chest quite well with it. I got strong very quickly with this lift. Uh, the dumbbells do kind of get in the way. It does let you get a nice stretch until the dumbbells kind of get too big. It's very easy to cheat. It's not very stable. A lot of these points I've already talked about with the incline dumbbell bench. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw this in the same tier as the incline dumbbell bench. So I'm going to put this with the beauties. The problem is with dumbbell bench press, actually, the strength potential is super high on these. And if you're someone like me that benches like probably 485 or something, it just gets it gets funky to use like you 100 pounds. I'm sorry, it's just not going to be challenging at that point. And if you're using like the 130s or 140s, the stability is probably going to be a limiting factor. And just the dumbbells are so big at that point. So I would say the dumbbell bench, it doesn't quite let you milk out those lighter weights like an incline dumbbell bench would, because it's stricter and obviously harder. So I'm going to put this, I'm tempted to put this down to tier. I'm going to put it down to tier. The margins are small, guys. They're small margins. They really are. That's how lifting works. Aside from things like hex press and archer push-ups, that's a large margin beneath anything else. Incline dumbbell fly, another very solid lift. It's a little bit harder to kind of stretch your chest around your rib cage, because your rib cage is obviously much flatter down here and it's lower, it's closer to your shoulder, versus a flat fly when you can really stretch more of the lower chest. So I'm going to put the incline dumbbell fly just one little tier below the regular dumbbell fly in the good complementary lift section. Excellent lift, really good lift, but it's not quite in these top two tiers. Can't quite be there. Up next, this is the football bar / the Swiss bar bench press. It's a good lift. The problems with this lift are, one, the grip. So you might be saying, oh, it's just a neutral grip. So yeah, I mean, your biceps still kind of lengthened, but that's assuming that you're doing a close grip with your elbows fully tucked. If you do a normal grip and your elbows flare out a little bit more like most people, you actually end up supinated. So instead of neutral would look like this. So a regular barbell bench is kind of just a neutral grip. It's pronated in the absolute definition. Like if you're looking bird's eye view, your hands are facing away from you. But with a Swiss bar, you twist all the way. So instead of what really is neutral in comparison to your upper arm, this is now a supinated press, just like kind of a reverse grip bench. So it does make it a little bit awkward. It's still a very good lift for the shoulder health. I do prefer it to the reverse grip bench overall. And once you kind of master this lift, it becomes a very solid lift to have. I like to use this mostly as a temporary rotation. So if one of my clients or myself is ever running into like shoulder issues or just shoulder kind of overuse, or even just like kind of some AC joint wear and tear, which I can be prone to myself, neutral grip pressing in the Swiss bar, it's a really cool option just to let your shoulder freshen up. Use that lift for 2 to 5, 6 weeks, depending on the seriousness of the pain that's being caused in your shoulder. So power just went out, but basically what I was saying is this is a great temporary rotation to let the shoulder freshen up. The Swiss bar bench, football bar bench, it's a little bit better than all of these. I'd put this in the complementary lifts tier. Might be, yeah, not quite in the beauties tier, just because of the supination. So I'm going to put this up in this tier, and this tier isn't ranked, by the way. These are all pretty equal in this complementary lift section. So up next, this is a seated cable press. The seated cable press it's a solid lift. The stabilization is a little bit funky, but basically this lift allows you to keep doing kind of like a dumbbell bench as the dumbbells get too chunky. So it is a cool solution. It can be tricky to set up, but if you have access to a proper seated cable press machine, it really is a great option. It's not the best it gets. You might say, oh, well, it converges, but it doesn't converge in the same way that a machine would, because as you're pressing, you still have to keep, obviously, the cable stacked. You're kind of pressing out and inwards. For that reason, since the tension is going to be a little bit outside of you in most cases, It's not really length and bias. So it is kind of like a mid to short range bias lift, but peak tension is going to be a little bit higher up just because you have to make sure, obviously, your upper arm is perpendicular to the cable itself to figure out where that peak resistance is. If the cable is directly behind you, like directly behind your elbows at the bottom, it is going to be length and biased, but usually in a functional trainer or one of these cable press machines, that's not the case. By the time your upper arm is perpendicular to the cable itself, usually around this section here, so it is kind of a mid to short biased press. It's a good lift. I think it's a little bit overrated for the people that do really like this lift. It's still totally fine. Stabilization is a little bit funky. There is opposing force, so it's still good. But I would say this is probably in the beauties tier. I would put it here. It's not very stable, but it's fine. It is fine. The tricky part with this is the cable has to go directly on top of your arm, so that one, it can be a little uncomfortable kind of wearing on your arm, but two, it also wants to kind of pull your wrist back, so you have to use a little bit more force to try and keep your elbow high so your wrist doesn't fly up above it, versus a dumbbell where gravity's not attached to a cable, so gravity can just go through your arm. It's not attached to a cable, to my knowledge, at least. So up next, we've got 2 lifts left. This is, I can't even see that. Is that just a regular barbell bench? Yeah, I think it's just, didn't I already do barbell bench? Yeah, why are there 2 barbell benches here? Oh, no. Nope. I knew this would happen to me. This is a Spoto bench. So a Spoto bench, for those of you that don't know, it's a powerlifting type bench where basically it's a pause bench, but you pause 1 to 3 inches off the chest. This is a very interesting lift because unlike a pin press or a floor press, where you might be getting kind of that same amount of range of motion, now you are required to stabilize and control that weight in that position. So while you don't quite get a full stretch, you do pause in a very high tension position. Pausing, in my opinion, is overrated as a whole, I think, especially in the natural community. But it is still a cool option. It's a cool way to get a little bit more out of less weight in some cases, but you can also just use more weight in other cases, depending on one, your own leverages, and two, how far off your chest you actually pause. It can be a little bit easier on the shoulders too if going super deep does just kind of bother your shoulders. So it is a good lift. I would put this in. It's better than all of these, I think. I don't know if it's as good as these. I'm going to put this at the bottom of good complementary lifts. That makes the most sense to me. And the final lift, I know you see 2 down here, but the Smith bench I already did. I don't know why there's 2 of them on here. They did that, not me. I will not take the blame. This is a Cassim Hansen N1 style cable press around. So it is a extremely short bias lift. It's an extremely short bias lift. I don't know why I said a. So it's an extremely short bias lift. This is the only lift there is out of all of like the conventional lifts for chest where you don't just press into your center. It's unilateral. The goal is to press past your center. So it's to get a truly full contraction. So you get more than something like a pec deck, more than a fly, way more than any press. And it's a very unique lift because normally training the short position, they're a dime a dozen. Every lift is like short biased, especially for isolations. This isn't an isolation. It looks like a fly, but it's actually a press. So it is a compound lift, but it's very short biased. It can be a little bit awkward to stabilize and set up, but you are going to be weaker in that position, so you don't have to use a whole ton of weight. So stabilization isn't quite as important for this one. But we're back. Power went out again. It makes no sense because it's super nice out, but either way, we're back. I'm going to try and do this quick just so the power doesn't go out third time. But the press around, I kind of already explained most points on this lift, so let's go through the criteria real quick and see if it fits well. So stability, it's kind of stable. I'm not going to act like this is an incredibly stable lift because it's really just not. It doesn't change a whole ton as long as your external stability is consistent. So as long as you have a proper post or something to hold on to that's very stable and you have a good grip on it, it should be fine. But you are going to be very dependent on your own bracing and your own setup, where other machines or something would just put you into the proper position. Converging, it does converge, probably a little bit too much in my opinion, to where it's just extremely short bias. But of course, that's on purpose. The stretch, non-existent, not at all. Even if you do get a deep stretch, there's literally zero tension on it. And then the resistance profile is it's kind of mid-range biased, so nothing too crazy there. I would say the cable press on this is a funky one to rate because it's very, very good and very effective at what it does. But what it does is just not that important in your program as a whole, especially when you have multiple just like S tiers, some A tier lifts in your program. It's very unique and it does something that no other lifts do. But how necessary really is getting a deep contraction and going so far beyond that midpoint when the length and position is probably just more important anyways, or not probably, it is more important anyways. So it is a tough one to rate. I would say it's somewhere in the middle because it's not a bad lift. It's just super niche, super niche. You can't really rank this one. It's kind of the unrankable lift. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it unranked and leave this one up to your own imagination, leave it up to your own input. So if you have any questions or any comments on this lift or on the tier list as a whole, let me know. If not, that's all I got for you today. Keep your eyes out for the next one. I have the best Q&A in bodybuilding history coming up pretty soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And I'm half kidding when I say that, but it will be a fun one, I think. I'll see you guys soon.